2,000 years ago, a man who had spent much of his life enslaved, with no legal rights, no property, no control over his own body, became one of the most quoted, most studied, most influential thinkers in human history. His name was Epictetus, and the reason his words have survived for 2,000 years isn't because he had access to comfort, power, or freedom. It's because he understood something about the human mind that remains just as true today as it was then. He taught that freedom isn't something given to you by your circumstances. It's something you build, internally, by training your mind to stop fighting the things it can't change, and start focusing completely on the one thing it always can. Today, we're going to spend an hour with his sharpest, most useful teachings, not as abstract philosophy, but as practical tools you can actually use. 10 quotes, 10 principles, each one broken down, explained, and applied to real situations you're probably facing right now. This isn't about memorizing ancient wisdom to sound smart at dinner parties. This is about training your mind the way Epictetus trained his students, directly, practically, without wasted words. If you stay until the end, you'll walk away with a mental toolkit that has helped people endure everything from personal loss to political upheaval to the daily frustrations of ordinary life. Because Epictetus wasn't writing for emperors. He was writing for regular people, trying to find peace in an uncertain world. People just like you. Before we start, if this kind of content is useful to you, hit subscribe, it's free, and it helps this reach more people who need it. Let's begin. Have you ever had a bad moment completely ruin the rest of your day? Someone cuts you off in traffic, a colleague sends a curt email, a plan falls through unexpectedly, and suddenly, that one moment, small, in the grand scheme of things, colors everything that follows. You're irritated at dinner, short with people you love, replaying the moment long after it's actually over. This is exactly what Epictetus was pointing at with one of his most famous teachings. It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. Notice the precision of that statement. He's not saying bad things don't happen. He's not saying pain isn't real. He's making a much sharper distinction between the event itself and your reaction to the event. Two completely different things, even though we usually experience them as one and the same. The traffic doesn't ruin your day. Your extended irritation about the traffic ruins your day. The email doesn't determine your mood. Your decision to carry that email's tone with you for the next 6 hours determines your mood. This might sound like semantics at first, but sit with it for a moment, and it becomes something much more powerful, because if the event and your reaction are actually separate things, that means your reaction is something you have influence over, not the event. The event already happened, but your reaction, that's still happening, right now, and it's still within your control. Think about two people experiencing the exact same setback, say, both getting passed over for a promotion they wanted. One spends weeks resentful, replaying it, letting it color how they see their entire job. The other feels the disappointment fully, for a day or two, and then redirects their energy toward what's next. Same event, completely different experience of it. The difference isn't that one person didn't care. It's that one person kept re-triggering the event in their own mind, long after it had already ended, while the other let the event actually end. Epictetus taught his students to catch themselves in this exact moment, the moment right after something happens, before the reaction fully takes hold. That's the window where you actually have power. Not to prevent the event, but to choose, consciously, how much of your day you're going to give it. So here's how to actually practice this. First, the next time something frustrating happens, pause before reacting, even just for 3 seconds. That tiny gap is where your power lives. Second, ask yourself directly, is my reaction right now proportional to what actually happened? Often, we discover our reaction has grown far larger than the event that triggered it. And finally, give yourself a limit. If something upset you, allow yourself to feel it, fully, honestly, but set an internal boundary. 10 minutes, an hour, a day, if it's serious, but not indefinitely. Because indefinite reaction is what turns a single bad moment into a bad week. The event will happen regardless of what you do. That part was never in your hands. But how long you carry it, that's always been yours to decide. Think about the last time you bought something you'd been wanting for a while. For a few days, maybe even a week, it felt great, and then, gradually, It just became part of your life. Normal, unremarkable, and somewhere along the way, your attention had already drifted to the next thing you wanted. This isn't a personal failing. It's a mechanism built into how human minds work. Psychologists call it hedonic adaptation. We adjust to whatever we have, and the satisfaction fades, leaving us looking for the next thing to chase. Epictetus identified this same pattern 2,000 years before modern psychology gave it a name. And his solution wasn't to acquire more efficiently. It was to change the equation entirely. Wealth consists not in having great possessions, but in having few wants. This reframes everything. Wealth, by this definition, isn't about the size of your bank account or the number of things you own. It's about the relationship between what you want and what you have. Close that gap, either by having more, or by wanting less, and you're wealthy. Widen it, no matter how much you accumulate, and you'll feel poor regardless. Here's what's radical about this. Most advice about achieving financial peace focuses entirely on the having more side of the equation. Work harder, earn more, build more, but Epictetus is pointing at the other lever, one that's actually far more within your control, and far faster to pull. Think about someone who earns a modest income but has genuinely stopped chasing more, who feels content with what they have, who isn't constantly comparing their life to a wealthier neighbor or a more successful friend. That person, by Epictetus's definition, is wealthy. Meanwhile, someone earning 10 times as much, but perpetually dissatisfied, perpetually comparing, perpetually chasing the next milestone, that person remains poor, no matter what their bank statement says. This doesn't mean ambition is wrong. Epictetus wasn't advocating for giving up on goals or accepting less than you're capable of. He was pointing at something more specific, the difference between healthy striving and unhealthy craving. Striving moves you forward without requiring the destination in order to feel okay right now. Craving makes your entire sense of peace contingent on getting something you don't yet have. Have you ever noticed how the things you already own rarely make you anxious, but the things you're still chasing often do? That's the craving at work, not the object itself, but your relationship to not having it yet. So how do you actually reduce wants rather than just chase more possessions? First, before buying something, pause and ask, am I solving an actual problem, or am I trying to fill a feeling? Often, wanting spikes when we're bored, stressed, or comparing ourselves to someone else, not when we genuinely need something. Second, practice noticing satisfaction in what you already have, deliberately, on a regular basis, not as a forced gratitude exercise, but as an honest accounting of what's already working in your life. And finally, when you notice a want arising, ask whether it's actually necessary, or whether it's simply the mind doing what minds do, looking for the next thing to chase. Sometimes just naming it that way is enough to loosen its grip. Wealth was never really about accumulation. Epictetus knew that owning nothing didn't make him poor. Wanting nothing more than what he had, that's what made him rich. Have you ever made a decision out of pure panic? Applied for a job you didn't even want because you were afraid of being unemployed? Or said yes to something out of fear of disappointing someone, rather than genuine desire? Most of us have, and most of the time, those panic-driven decisions don't turn out well, not because the decision itself was necessarily wrong, but because it came from the wrong place. Fear, rather than clarity. Epictetus offered a different approach. First say to yourself what you would be, and then do what you have to do. This sounds simple, but it reverses how most people actually operate. Most of us act first, then figure out what kind of person our actions suggest we are. Epictetus is suggesting the opposite order. Decide who you want to be first, and let your actions follow from that clarity, rather than from whatever fear or pressure happens to be present in the moment. Think about the difference between someone job hunting from a place of panic versus someone job hunting from a place of clarity about who they are and what they actually want. The panicked person applies everywhere, says yes to anything, and often ends up somewhere that doesn't actually fit them, because the decision was driven by fear of not having something, rather than by clarity about what they genuinely wanted. The person with clarity moves differently. They know what kind of work aligns with their values, what kind of environment they thrive in, what they're actually good at and enjoy. Their applications are more targeted. Their interviews are more confident. Because they're not desperately trying to be chosen. They're evaluating whether it's actually a fit. This applies far beyond career decisions. Think about relationships. Someone who enters a relationship out of fear of being alone often ends up compromising on things that matter, because their underlying motivation was avoiding loneliness rather than genuinely wanting that specific connection. Someone who knows who they are, what they value, and what kind of partnership actually fits their life, that person makes very different choices, from a much steadier place. Epictetus wasn't suggesting some elaborate self-discovery process before you're allowed to act. He was pointing at something more immediate, a moment of pause before decisions, where you ask yourself honestly, is this coming from clarity about who I want to be? Or is this coming from fear of what might happen if I don't do it? Have you noticed how decisions made from fear tend to feel heavy, urgent, almost desperate? And decisions made from clarity, even difficult ones, tend to feel more grounded, even when they're not easy. So how do you practice this? First, before a significant decision, pause and ask directly, what kind of person do I want to be in this situation? Not what will make the discomfort go away fastest, what actually aligns with who you're trying to become. Second, notice when you're acting from fear versus from values. Fear-driven decisions often have an urgent, grasping quality. Values-driven decisions, even when they're hard, tend to feel more like a choice than a reaction. And finally, give yourself permission to slow down. Most panic-driven decisions happen because we feel we need to decide immediately. Very few decisions actually require that speed. Taking even a day to return to your own clarity before acting can completely change the outcome. Epictetus, who had every reason to act from fear given the circumstances of his life, instead built a philosophy entirely around acting from clarity. If someone with that little external freedom could find that internal steadiness, it's available to the rest of us too. This quote sounds intense at first hearing, but its actual meaning is less about death itself, and more about what fear of loss does to how we live. Epictetus taught his students to regularly consider impermanence, not morbidly, but as a way of loosening the grip that fear of loss has on our daily decisions. Because when we're terrified of losing something, we often make choices driven entirely by that fear, rather than by what actually matters to us. He who has learned to die has unlearned how to be a slave. In other words, someone who has made peace with the fact that everything is temporary, relationships, possessions, even life itself, is no longer controlled by the fear of losing those things. And that person, paradoxically, becomes far freer than someone desperately trying to hold on to permanence that was never actually available in the first place. Think about how much of daily anxiety comes from fear of loss. Fear of losing a relationship, so you avoid difficult but necessary conversations. Fear of losing financial security, so you stay in situations that don't actually serve you. Fear of losing social approval, so you shape your entire personality around what other people might think. All of that fear is, at its root, a fear of impermanence, a refusal to accept that things change, that relationships end, that circumstances shift, regardless of how tightly we try to hold on to them. Epictetus's radical suggestion was this: accept impermanence directly, rather than spending your life trying to avoid it, not with despair, but with a kind of clear-eyed acceptance that actually creates more freedom, not less. Consider someone who has genuinely made peace with the fact that a relationship might end, not because they don't value it, but because they've accepted its impermanence. That person tends to show up more authentically, more honestly, because they're not desperately performing to prevent an outcome that was never fully in their control anyway. And ironically, that authenticity often makes relationships stronger, not weaker. Compare that to someone who is terrified of loss, who shapes every interaction around preventing an ending that might come regardless of what they do. That fear-driven approach tends to create exactly the outcome it's trying to avoid, because desperation, clinging, and inauthenticity tend to push people away rather than hold them close. This principle extends to career, to possessions, to nearly every domain of life. The person who has made peace with the possibility of losing their job tends to negotiate more confidently, take more principled stands, and paradoxically often performs better, because they're not operating from constant fear. So how do you actually practice this without becoming morbid or detached? First, notice where fear of loss is currently shaping your decisions. Is there a relationship, A job, a situation where you're making choices primarily to avoid an ending, rather than from genuine values? Second, practice sitting with the discomfort of impermanence directly. Rather than avoiding it, acknowledge, honestly, that everything you have is temporary, not to create anxiety, but to loosen its grip on your daily decisions. And finally, ask yourself what you would do differently if you weren't afraid of losing this. Often, the answer reveals a more authentic, more courageous path than the one fear has been steering you toward. Freedom, for Epictetus, was never about having everything guaranteed. It was about no longer needing that guarantee in order to live fully. Two people can experience the exact same event and walk away with completely different emotional responses. Same traffic jam, same difficult conversation, same unexpected setback, and yet one person is furious, and the other is completely unbothered. What accounts for that difference? Not the event. It was identical for both of them. The difference is entirely in what Epictetus called the views they took of the event, the interpretation. The meaning, the story each person attached to what happened. Man is disturbed not by things, but by the views he takes of them. This is, in many ways, the foundational insight of the entire Stoic school of thought, and it remains one of the most useful psychological tools available to anyone. In any era. Think about a cancelled plan. One interpretation: this is a disaster. I was looking forward to this. Now my whole day is ruined. Another interpretation: this is disappointing, but it also frees up time I didn't expect to have. Same event, two completely different emotional experiences, generated entirely by the interpretation layered on top of it. This isn't about forcing positivity or pretending difficult things are actually fine. It's about recognizing that there's always a gap between what happens and what we make it mean, and that gap is where our actual suffering, or our actual peace, gets created. Epictetus taught his students to interrogate their own interpretations rather than accepting them automatically. When something upsets you, the useful question isn't just, what happened? It's, what am I telling myself this means? Often, when you separate the event from the story, the event itself turns out to be far smaller than the story made it feel. Consider someone who receives critical feedback at work. One interpretation: I'm not good enough. I'm failing. This confirms my worst fears about myself. Another interpretation: this is useful information that will help me improve. Same feedback, wildly different emotional and practical outcomes, depending entirely on which interpretation takes hold. This is genuinely difficult to practice, because our interpretations often feel automatic, immediate, almost like facts rather than choices. But Epictetus insisted that with practice, we can learn to notice the interpretation forming, and choose, consciously, whether to accept it or question it. Have you ever, in hindsight, realized that something you were once convinced was a disaster turned out, eventually, to be one of the better things that happened to you? That gap between the interpretation in the moment and the reality that unfolded later is worth remembering the next time an event feels catastrophic in real time. So how do you practice this directly? First, when something upsets you, pause and ask explicitly, what actually happened? Versus what am I telling myself it means? Separating those two things, even just verbally, creates immediate distance from automatic distress. Second, consider alternative interpretations deliberately, not to force false positivity, but to genuinely explore whether your first interpretation is the only reasonable one, or simply the most automatic one. And finally, remember that you've been wrong about your own catastrophic predictions before. Most feared outcomes don't happen, and even when they do, they're rarely as unmanageable as the anticipation suggested they would be. You cannot always choose what happens, but you can, with practice, choose the view you take of it, and that choice, more than almost anything else, determines whether a given day feels like suffering or simply like life moving through you, one event at a time. What does freedom actually mean? Most of us think of freedom in external terms: freedom from obligation, freedom to do what we want, freedom from constraints imposed by circumstances or other people. But Epictetus, who had less external freedom than almost anyone in recorded history, defined freedom completely differently. No man is free who is not master of himself. By this definition, someone with unlimited external freedom, money, time, no obligations, who is still controlled by their own impulses, fears, and reactive emotions, is not actually free at all. And someone with very little external freedom, but complete mastery over their own mind, is freer than almost anyone. Think about what it actually means to be mastered by something other than yourself. Someone who cannot control their temper is, in a real sense, enslaved to their temper. It dictates their behavior, their relationships, their outcomes, regardless of what they consciously want. Someone who cannot resist compulsive spending is enslaved to that compulsion, regardless of how much money they actually have. Someone who cannot say no, who constantly bends to others' expectations out of fear of disapproval, is enslaved to that fear, regardless of how much external freedom their circumstances technically provide. Epictetus's central teaching was that this internal mastery is the only freedom that actually matters, because external freedom can be taken away by circumstances, by other people, by simple bad luck, but internal mastery, once developed, cannot be taken from you by anyone. He built this philosophy while enslaved, with virtually no external freedom of any kind. And yet, by his own definition, he was free, because his mind, his responses, his internal world remained entirely his own, regardless of what was done to his external circumstances. This is a genuinely radical reframe. It means freedom isn't something that has to be given to you, earned through circumstances, or granted by anyone else. It's something you build, internally, through the ongoing practice of mastering your own reactions, impulses, and patterns. Consider two people facing the same stressful situation, a difficult boss. Say, one is completely reactive, their entire mood and behavior dictated by whatever the boss does or says. The other has developed enough internal mastery that they can choose their response, regardless of what's happening externally. The first person, despite having identical external circumstances, is far less free than the second. Have you noticed patterns in your own life where you feel controlled by something, a habit, a reaction, a fear, rather than genuinely choosing your response? That's exactly the territory Epictetus is pointing at. So how do you actually build this internal mastery? First, identify one pattern where you feel reactive rather than intentional, a habit, an emotional trigger, a compulsion. Simply naming it clearly is the first step toward mastering it. Second, practice the pause between stimulus and response. That small gap, even just a few seconds, is where mastery actually gets built. One moment at a time. And finally, understand that mastery isn't about suppressing every impulse perfectly. It's about gradually increasing your capacity to choose, rather than simply react, more and more often over time. Freedom was never really about your circumstances. It was always about whether you're the one steering your own mind, or whether something else, fear, habit, impulse, is steering it for you. Difficult situations have a way of showing us things about ourselves we didn't fully know were there, both good and bad. Epictetus taught that circumstances don't actually create character. They reveal character that was already present, simply dormant, waiting for the right pressure to bring it to the surface. Circumstances don't make the man. They only reveal him to himself. Think about how differently people respond to the exact same crisis. Some rise to meet it with unexpected strength, patience, and clarity. Others fall apart, revealing fear or selfishness they didn't know was there, or perhaps knew but had never been tested. The crisis didn't create either response. It simply revealed what was already present, underneath the surface of ordinary daily life. This reframes how we might think about difficulty. Rather than seeing hard times purely as obstacles to survive, Epictetus suggested seeing them also as information, opportunities to discover what you're actually made of, what values you actually hold when tested, what strength you actually possess when it's required. Think about a moment in your own life when circumstances genuinely tested you, a loss, a failure, an unexpected challenge. What did that moment reveal about you that you might not have known otherwise? Perhaps a strength you didn't realize you had. Perhaps a pattern you'd rather not have discovered. But that gave you useful information about where you still need to grow. Epictetus wasn't suggesting we should seek out hardship for its own sake. But he was suggesting a different relationship to hardship when it inevitably arrives, treating it less as pure misfortune, and more as a kind of clarifying mirror, showing you something true about yourself that comfort and ease would never have revealed. Consider two people facing a significant financial setback. One discovers, through the process, A resourcefulness and resilience they didn't know they had. They adapt. Problem solve. Find their footing. The other discovers a tendency toward panic, blame, or avoidance. Neither response was created by the setback. Both were already present, as tendencies, before the setback arrived. The setback simply brought them into visible reality. This is useful, even if uncomfortable, because it means difficulty isn't purely wasted suffering. Even the parts of yourself revealed that you're not proud of, those are valuable information too. Showing you exactly where your internal work still needs attention. Have you noticed that the people you most admire for their strength of character usually develop that strength through difficulty? Not through ease? That's not a coincidence. Ease rarely reveals or builds character. Difficulty almost always does, one way or another. So how do you actually apply this? First, the next time you're facing something difficult, notice what it's revealing about you, both strengths and patterns you'd like to change. That information is valuable, regardless of how uncomfortable the circumstance itself feels. Second, resist the urge to see hardship purely as something happening to you. Without any information for you, even painful circumstances tend to carry useful clarity about who you actually are, underneath the comfort of ordinary days. And finally, use what's revealed. If a difficulty shows you a pattern you don't like, reactivity, avoidance, fear, that revelation is actually the beginning of change, not just evidence of a flaw. You cannot change what you haven't yet seen clearly. The circumstances themselves were never really the point. What they revealed about you, that's the part worth paying attention to. There's a particular kind of person most of us have encountered, someone who talks extensively about their values, their principles, their philosophy of life, but whose actual behavior doesn't consistently match any of it. Epictetus had little patience for this gap. Don't explain your philosophy, embody it. His teaching wasn't really about philosophy in the academic sense at all. It was entirely about how you actually live, moment to moment, regardless of what you claim to believe. This is a genuinely uncomfortable teaching to sit with honestly, because most of us have some version of this gap somewhere in our lives. Values we articulate clearly but don't always practice consistently. Patience we claim to value, but abandon the moment we're actually tested. Honesty we say matters to us, but that we compromise when it's inconvenient. Epictetus taught his students that talking about virtue is essentially worthless compared to actually practicing it, especially in difficult moments when practicing it is genuinely hard. Anyone can claim to value patience when nothing is testing their patience. The real measure is what happens when something actually does. Think about the difference between someone who talks extensively about staying calm under pressure, and someone who has simply, quietly, demonstrated that calm across many actual pressured situations, without needing to announce it. The second person's philosophy is embodied. The first person's, until tested, remains only theoretical. This matters because it's easy to feel philosophically sophisticated, to read, to understand concepts, to be able to articulate wisdom clearly, while your actual daily behavior remains largely unchanged. Understanding a principle intellectually and actually living it are two entirely different achievements. And Epictetus was almost exclusively interested in the second one. Consider your own stated values right now. Patience, honesty, discipline, kindness. Now consider honestly, where in your recent behavior have those values actually been tested? And how did you respond? That gap, wherever it exists, is exactly where Epictetus would direct your attention. Not toward understanding the value better intellectually, but toward actually closing the distance between what you believe and what you do. This isn't about perfection. Epictetus himself acknowledged that living philosophy consistently is genuinely difficult. A lifelong practice rather than an achievement you complete once. But the direction matters, moving consistently toward embodiment, rather than remaining comfortable in mere understanding. Have you noticed how much more impact you feel from someone who quietly demonstrates a value through action, compared to someone who talks about that same value extensively? That difference is exactly what Epictetus is pointing toward. So how do you actually practice this? First, choose one value you claim to hold, and identify a specific recent situation where you didn't fully embody it. Not to judge yourself harshly, but to see clearly where the gap actually exists. Second, look for the next opportunity to practice that value directly, in action, without necessarily talking about it. Let the practice itself be the demonstration, rather than the explanation. And finally, measure your philosophical growth not by what you can articulate, but by what you actually do differently, especially in moments that test you. That's the only measure Epictetus considered meaningful. Philosophy was never meant to be an intellectual accessory. For Epictetus, it was entirely a practice, something you do, not something you merely understand. There's a particular kind of stuckness that comes not from lack of information, but from being too certain you already understand something. Epictetus taught that genuine learning requires a kind of humility that most of us resist. Especially about things we feel confident we already understand. It is impossible for a man to learn what he thinks he already knows. This applies far beyond formal education. Think about relationships where you feel certain you already understand the other person, their motivations, their patterns, what they mean when they say certain things. That certainty, however comfortable, often closes off the actual curiosity that would let you understand them more accurately, more currently, rather than through an outdated picture you formed once and never updated. The same applies to self-knowledge. Many of us carry a fixed idea of who we are, our strengths, our limitations, our patterns, formed years ago, and rarely questioned since. That fixed self-image, however familiar, can actually prevent us from noticing genuine growth or change that's already happened, because we're too certain we already know the answer. Epictetus taught his students to approach even familiar subjects with a kind of ongoing openness, not performative humility, but genuine curiosity about what they might still not fully understand, even about things they'd studied extensively. Consider an area of your life where you feel highly confident in your understanding, a relationship, a skill, even your own personality. Now consider honestly, when was the last time you genuinely questioned that understanding, rather than simply confirming what you already believed? This isn't about doubting everything constantly, which would be exhausting and impractical. It's about maintaining enough humility, especially in areas of high confidence, to remain genuinely open to new information, rather than filtering everything through a certainty that stopped updating itself long ago. Have you noticed how the most genuinely wise people you know tend to hold their opinions with a certain lightness, remaining curious even about things they know well, while people who are actually less knowledgeable often hold their views with much greater rigidity? That's not a coincidence. Certainty and genuine understanding are often inversely related, past a certain point. So how do you practice this? First, identify one area where you feel very certain of your understanding, and deliberately ask what you might still be missing, even there. Second, practice genuine curiosity in conversations, especially with people you feel you already understand well. Ask questions as though you're hearing their perspective for the first time, rather than confirming what you already assume. And finally, hold your own self-concept a little more loosely. You are very likely not exactly the same person you were even a year ago, and your understanding of yourself may not have fully caught up with who you've actually become. Genuine wisdom, for Epictetus, was never about accumulating more certainty. It was about maintaining enough humility to keep learning, even in the areas where you feel most confident you already know. We've spent this hour with 9 teachings, each pointing toward a similar underlying truth. Now, this final quote brings them all together. Seek not that the things which happen should happen as you wish, but wish the things which happen to be as they are, and you will have a tranquil flow of life. This is, in many ways, the culmination of everything Epictetus taught. Not passive resignation, not giving up on effort or ambition, but a fundamental reorientation, away from demanding that reality conform to your preferences, and toward aligning your preferences with reality as it actually unfolds. Think about how much daily friction comes from this exact mismatch, wanting things to be different than they are. Right now, in this moment, traffic that should move faster, a person who should behave differently, circumstances that should have unfolded another way. Each of these represents a small war against reality, a war that reality always wins. Eventually, because reality doesn't actually negotiate with our preferences. Epictetus's radical suggestion was to end that war entirely, not by giving up on improving things where improvement is genuinely possible, but by releasing the exhausting demand that things should already be different than they currently are. This doesn't mean passive acceptance of everything, including things within your power to change. It means accepting things as they currently stand, in this exact moment, while still working, wherever possible, toward change going forward. The acceptance is about right now. The effort remains about the future. Consider the relief available in simply accepting current reality exactly as it is, not because it's ideal, but because fighting against what has already happened wastes energy that could instead go toward what happens next. The traffic is what it is right now. Your energy is better spent adapting than resenting. This single teaching, applied consistently, touches everything we've discussed today: releasing reactive suffering, contentment with what you have, acting from clarity rather than fear, mastering your own responses, learning from what circumstances reveal, embodying rather than just understanding, and remaining humble enough to keep learning. All of it comes back to this same fundamental alignment: wishing things to be as they actually are, rather than endlessly wishing they were different. So here's the practice to carry forward from everything we've covered today. First, notice, throughout your days, the moments when you're silently wishing something were different than it currently is. Traffic, weather, other people's behavior, your own circumstances. Second, in each of those moments, practice a small internal shift, not resignation, but acceptance of what currently is, paired with continued effort toward what might become, going forward. And finally, remember that tranquility, for Epictetus, was never about controlling everything. It was about no longer needing to. That's the entire practice, distilled into a single sentence, from a man who owned almost nothing and became one of the freest minds in human history. 10 teachings, from a man who turned having nothing into a philosophy that has outlasted empires. Epictetus never wrote a single word himself. Everything we know of his teaching comes from students who wrote down what he said. And what he said, again and again, was remarkably consistent. Your freedom was never about your circumstances. It was always about your mind. If even one of these 10 teachings gave you something useful to carry forward, that's exactly what this was for. If this helped you today, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. We release new Stoic philosophy content every week, built to give you real tools, not just quotes to admire. And in the comments, tell me which of these 10 teachings hit hardest for you today. I read every comment, and I'd genuinely like to know. Until next time, train your mind. Everything else follows from there.